Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on stewarding donors in a turbulent time. Really glad you could take the time out of your day to join us and appreciate you wanting to learn a little bit more about this work that we do as community foundations. Just a couple of things before we get started. We have everyone on mute, so you can hear us, but we can't hear you. So this helps us with the clarity of sound and the quality of the presentation. We are recording this presentation and it will be available in our library following today's session, and just go to the CFC Resource Library under the Learning Institute. In order for you to get the most out of today's experience, we ask that you mute yourself if you haven't already done so. Turn off your camera just to ensure that we don't maximize our bandwidth here. And also to ask questions. We have some great presenters today, and so we want you to use the chat function in order to ask questions of our presenters, and so we'll have some time at the end to do so. So please use that opportunity to ask, clarify, share, whatever you would like to do. So my name is Cindy Lindsay, and I'm the Director of Learning and Foundation Engagement and with Community Foundations of Canada. So it's my pleasure to be your host today. And joining us are three amazing people involved in the philanthropic world of community foundations. First is Sherry Meredith, who is an advisor of philanthropic services at the Hamilton Community Foundation. And then joining from the donor engagement team from the Winnipeg Foundation is Mary Beth Taylor, and hopefully Kathy Auld, who I know has some problems connecting today. But I know Mary Beth, if Kathy can't join us, you'll be more than able to represent her. So thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate you coming on board to do this. So, and before we get started, I just need to do some unmuting here, and just bear with me as we do this. Oh, Kathy, I've got you unmuted. Hi, Kathy. Mary Beth, I got you on.
Hello. Hello. Good morning or good afternoon.
Okay. And Sherry. I've got you unmuted. Okay. So away we go. Got a bit of an echo. So I think what I will do is switch over to the so to get started here, what I've asked our presenters to focus on today are three questions when it comes to donor stewardship, and especially when we look at our work related to COVID-19. Hi, folks. Can you hear me? Okay.
Okay. Sorry for that glitch we had. Sherry and you could mute yourself so you could avoid some noise. Okay. So, sorry for the delay here, folks. So what does donor stewardship embody in a time of uncertainty? Are there learnings from the financial crisis in 2008, and how can a community foundation engage donors in this particular climate, being at a distance and working remotely. So as we venture deeper and deeper into this pandemic and how we want to work with our donors, it's great that both Sherry, Mary Beth, and Kathy can share their experiences at their community foundations. And so thank you so much for joining us today, and really appreciate you taking the time. So Mary Beth, I'll maybe turn it over to you now, and just to talk about this work of stewarding donors. I'll get you unmuted here. There we go.
There. Still muted there. Hi, everyone. We're seeing this right now as, although it is a confusing, scary, challenging time, it's also, from a donor stewardship perspective, a gift wrapped in barbed wire. This is a really good opportunity for us to have meaningful and thoughtful communication with our donors, really listen to where their priorities are and how they're feeling, and really hearing that important feedback. So I'm going to pass it over a little bit to Kathy right now to kind of set the stage as to how this is similar to the times of 2008. And then I'm going to walk us through how it was a little different and how we're approaching things in the pandemic.
Yeah, thanks, Mary Beth and Sandy. Thanks everyone for this chance to have some conversation together.
Kathy, can I just stop you? Just connect that. I don't know.
I'm sorry, are you getting the audio?
Yeah, but it's really choppy.
Okay, yeah, that's how I'm hearing it from others as well.
Okay. Perhaps we can redial in, and we'll just continue.
Okay, I'm going to try maybe on my phone this next time.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Okay, so Mary Beth, do you want to take over here again? My apologies, folks. Zoom is not cooperating with us today. So I'll just carry on a little bit until Mary Beth and Kathy can join us again. So if any of you were here during that 2008 and 2009 crisis with when the global investment markets really took a massive downturn, and I was working at a community foundation at the time, you can see what the impact of this had in terms of, donations were declining. Community foundations and the whole not-for-profit sector were caught in this incredible squeeze. We saw our returns go into the negatives. Any new funds that were set up at that time were well below the watermark for a few years. And it just turned out to be such a challenge for us in terms of granting and facilitating our work. And it was something that it took us a long time to get out of. So I think, sorry, I'm just trying to unmute Mary Beth here. And so as community foundations, we, there was a lot of examination of investment policies. There was a lot of examination of how we work as community foundations. And Mary Beth, I've got you unmuted again. And so I'll just carry on here, but
go ahead.
while we wait for Kathy to join us, but you know, Faye Whiteman, who was the chair or president of the Vancouver Foundation at the time, said, you know, recognized that this was not an isolated problem, you know, for all foundations that set up endowments for charities, because we were reaching out to donors and asking them to support flow through gifts. We were, you know, and the fact that it took a long time for our endowments to recover. Mary Beth, do you want to take over from here?
Sure. So, and is Kathy joining? Has she?
She's going to call back.
Okay, she's still coming on. You know what I'm going to suggest? Why don't we skip ahead to my slide, which is, I think, slide 11, and then we can just have Kathy join when she's back, because she's speaking specifically about that time, because she worked at the foundation.
Yeah.
So if we want to start there, and then we can go back. So here we go. Thank you, everyone. And isn't technology fun? We're finding ourselves in quite the time. I wanted to share with everyone right now this piece of art that was produced and provided to us by a fund holder named Cal Bertesky. She has the Polar Bear Fund at the Winnipeg Foundation, and she's a wildlife painter, but also does this beautiful script art. And she and her 3 daughters sat down and thought about all the good things that they could do while they were self-isolating as a family, and all the things they needed to avoid. And I like this and wanted to share it with you today, because you can see the list of what's good is longer than the list of what's bad. And so it's a time for us to kind of focus on what is positive and how we can work with our donors at this time. Cal has very generously shared this art publicly and encouraged people to print it and share it with others. So I have a framed copy of it in my office, and I say that in quotation marks, which is a desk in my bedroom. School is a dining room table in my dining room. And it's just a good reminder, and I invite all of you to do the same, because it's quite a special piece. Okay, next slide, please. So what we did at the Winnipeg Foundation is we said, although this is a confusing and scary and challenging time, as I said earlier, it also is a time that's providing us with an opportunity. And we're really using this as a chance to have thoughtful and very meaningful communication with our donors. So at the Winnipeg Foundation, I manage the donor engagement team, and we're a team of about 11 who are all focused on varying types of donor relationships. So we have some donor advised funds, we have a legacy society, we also have donors who don't make gifts to fund types and aren't fund holders, they just make gifts to our work. We have monthly donors, so we have a real variety of donors. We had to prepare our plan very quickly, and we did so in a matter of days, in some cases hours. And we did this during the early days of isolation, when we thought we were actually going to only be working like this for 4 to 6 weeks. And now as it's evolving to a longer time period, so is our plan. We realized in that first week of isolation, and I'm sure a lot of you will nod when I say this, I saw this meme that was posted at that time that said, "Oh good, I've always wanted to know how every single business that I ever gave my email address to is approaching COVID-19. We can all remember that we were inundated with feedback of, we take your information seriously, all of those things. And we wanted our donor information to really stand out and be special and not fall into that category. We didn't want to be trapped in spam. We really wanted it to be meaningful. So we got to work very quickly, and we grouped our donors based on the donor type and the relationships that we have with them. And we drafted a specific message for each of those groups. And we delivered it in the way that our donors appreciate hearing from us. The message was a specific message from our CEO that asked our donors simply, how are you doing during this time? And also provided some information about how the Winnipeg Foundation was responding and how their gifts were at work. We then followed up in a tailored way with the method of communication that our donors are used to. So if a donor preferred a phone call, they received phone calls. If a donor preferred handwritten notes, that's how we've been communicating with them. And in many cases, it's an email exchange back and forth, and that's okay. But instead of doing it in an e-wire, if you will, email way, we actually sent personal emails as best we could. Our numbers are pretty huge, so we did it based on the closeness that the individual has with us, and often in cases we had a personal note, but it came from someone rather than just from the organization. In order to manage this, we broke up our large team, which I said is about 11 people, into smaller donor teams. So we had 2 donor staff people working with a support team member. And we did this for very real reasons. We're all experiencing the challenges of working remotely. And this was a way of making sure that we weren't putting too much strain on our database, which we're all accessing remotely. But we also, more than that, wanted to make sure that we were working in smaller teams, and that was allowing us to make sure that if any of us ever have to step back, the donor communication doesn't stop. At all times, there are backup and there are people knowing what the other is doing. And that's been really allowing us to record our work and make sure that we're still continuing that important donor engagement work, but we're also looking out for each other. This is informing our work because it's allowing us to hear what our donors are thinking and where their priorities are right now. We have a separate exercise happening on the other side of the organization, if you will, in various houses around our city, but being done by our colleagues in grants and in communications. So what they're doing is they're talking to grantees and the larger sector to hear where their priorities are, what their challenges are, and then we're getting one report. We're doing the same with donors. So our donor information is being categorized and being tracked so that when we come out of this, we're able to know where our donors' priorities are and how they feel about our response, and it allows us to evolve as we go on. Next slide, please. So the outreach campaign has really changed how we work. Not only has it increased the volume of how we're communicating with donors, but it has also changed how we're responding to the community's needs. So we used to process our donor advised grants twice a month, which was quite sufficient in terms of how we worked. Now we've shifted that process to once a week, and in some cases, as need be, multiple times a week. We've also shifted from largely focusing on endowment to more flow-through gifts. So we're actually allowing and offering as a service to fund holders. They can make a gift to their fund and we can flow it out immediately to the various organizations or to our COVID-19 response fund. And we're also really helping charities who don't have the capacities right now to do this type of work. So we're saying if you make a gift to us, we're getting it out quickly to the organization, because a lot of those organizations right now are focused on response. And we don't want an ED focused on receiving a gift or that donor engagement. Let our team manage that and allow those organizations to focus their priority on helping our community. And that's also a cost savings for the organization because we're eating those fees. And next slide, please. And plan giving. This is an area where we've, there's been a lot of need for sensitivity. We're in a pandemic time, and it's a very scary time. But we're hearing from our donors, and we're hearing from statistics in the community that there are a lot of people right now who are really looking for that will wording and to get their affairs in order. We've had conversations like we've never had before, where we've had donors actually call us saying, we had a medical professional phone and say, I'm going in the front lines, I need to make sure I have a will. That is not the kind of that kind of communication we've normally had with our donors. So we are making sure that the information is thoughtfully provided in a way that is appropriate, and also allowing our agency partners to also have access to that will wording. So we're working with our agencies to make sure that they have what they need to respond to plan gift inquiries. We also have hosted for 15 years something called Will Week, which was a partnership with a lot of stakeholders, including the public guardian trustee. And we provided will workshops across the city during the last week of April. Well, obviously that has to be canceled this year because there are no gatherings. So what we're doing is having that virtually. So we will have all of the resources online available, as well as a presentation that will be recorded and allowed so people can listen to it at their leisure. We've also really looked at how we're approaching memorial gifts in a different way. So right now, as we know, funerals and memorial services are not happening in communities. And that's a very difficult time for families grieving. They are, they're not having that same opportunity to even gather as families and talk about loved ones. They're doing it in their own homes, and then there's not the opportunity for the service or the celebration of life that we as community generally do. So we have really changed how we're responding to memorial gifts. In the obituaries, if the Winnipeg Foundation is mentioned, or it's someone that we know or has had any form of a relationship with us, we're actually now sending a handwritten note just telling them that we're thinking of them during this difficult time. In addition, we have developed something that we don't like to talk about, but it is something that is ensuring that our donor engagement and the service that our donors are used to receiving continues, which is our worst case scenario. So if there is a situation where Winnipeg or Manitoba is hit in a very drastic way with this awful pandemic, our donors will still, and their families will still receive the memorial attention that they have always received with the cards and the listings. So we have taken that remotely, and that was one of the first strategies that we developed. So people, our team are mobilized at home with cards and stamped envelopes and everything that they need so that that service would not cease. And during these days, we're still managing that on a regular basis. So again, that's an aspect of this that we don't want to talk about and we don't like to talk about, but it's something that unfortunately we have planned for so that our donors receive that comfort during a difficult time. And obviously our public health officials are working very hard to make sure that all is well. So that's my portion, and I'll pass it over to Sherry.
Thank you. Am I unmuted, Cindy?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Mary Beth. Good afternoon, everyone. I think, some of the things that I'm going to say are very much aligned with what Mary Beth has been talking about. Some of our examples are the same as well, but there's probably some other things that we're doing because of our size and location that might be useful to add. So when I was thinking about this, I was thinking there are really three important considerations. And one I would refer to as stewardship continuity. The second is providing options and flexibility. And the third is having a really solid foundation or a base of policy so that you're consistent, transparent, and all those things. If you could go to the next slide, Cindy, please. So in terms of stewardship continuity, we really did learn a lot from 2008 when so many of our regular donors were unable to make a gift. And some people were very embarrassed by that. As is the tradition, we don't talk about money with people. And so, but we wanted, and we did at that time, to almost increase our stewardship and treat people in the same way, with the same level of responsiveness and contact, and thanking that we did whether when they previously had made a gift. And we found that, and we assumed that when things returned to a different normal, that they would resume their giving, that they would stay connected. And that proved to be so. And people talked after about how respectfully and how it had deepened their sense of connection with the foundation. And so I think, again, it's an opportunity to further develop your existing relationships, and in many cases, develop new relationships. And we've found it a really interesting opportunity currently to deepen our relationships. I think we all are finding probably that people are talking more about values. They're really talking about what's important to them. They're taking time and reflecting on things that they might not have publicly, or with someone like a stranger or a person a non-family member, that they might not have done so before. And so it's a really important time to connect and to listen to people and understand with the philanthropy lens, what is so important to them. From there, we took an approach that in our connections that we were not calling to solicit gifts, but in fact, so many people in our community are hit from a business perspective, stock market perspective, that we really wanted to make people aware of options, but in no way be phoning to make an ask, as they're already receiving many every day. So like Mary Beth was describing, we developed a really segmented strategy, looking at our fund holders, our donors to our larger community fund, past board members, people we had relationships with, people who had future gifts, and really developed a very segmented and often very personalized strategy and to communicate with them. We're a much smaller team, but nonetheless, I think the principle's the same about how do you tailor it to the individual to be most effective, and use those resources that you have most effectively. So we have done all sorts of calls. We've certainly done some emails. We're having, at the end of this month, a webinar where fund holders particularly, but also very active donors, are invited to call in to learn more about what we're doing, talk about options. We have a women's giving circle, and when we talk to some of the members of that, they said, it's almost like we want to come together. It's a bit of a support group. We want to talk about things and talk about how we can make a difference. So, we're organizing a Zoom call for those folks that will have a slightly different strategy to it, but very much with the same sort of underlying principles. We also, made it's really important to gather this information, and Mary Beth, I think, spoke to this as well. We have many charts, but also to take what we're learning about donors and make sure that we can use that to inform our plans with them in the future, to ensure that we continue to deliver personalized and excellent services. I think the last point's important too, and that is to enable donors to share your story. One of the things that we've done, which we hadn't previously done, is formalize that every 2 weeks we have a meeting with our grants team so that we're updated and we have some stories to tell, and that we can describe the foundation's strategy. So in our case, it's kind of a sequence strategy where we set up a pandemic response fund, as many community foundations have. As an organization, we're doing some things to build that fund, and we can tell that. But then grants from that fund, very immediately, a set went out to do emergency response. And then the next layer is a call where organizations can put in requests, and there will be a series of those grants. And then there will also be some of the funds used for a longer term as we all recover. So being able to share that with donors, they then share that with the other people. And we have had one or two donors who have actually taken up, excuse me, a campaign where they're calling and informing their networks of the fund, what it's doing, and inviting people to contribute to that. If I could go to the next slide, please. So providing options and flexibility, again, just as we did in 2008, and I hear everybody doing this, it's really important to use all those options that we have and perhaps some new ones for donors. And I think one of the things that sometimes we maybe undervalue or don't articulate is that we are available to help donors actually figure out their giving strategy. And as we all know, they're getting asked every day to give and to do this and that and pulled in many directions. And so helping them access the information, helping them, I guess even first, think through kind of what's important to them. What areas do they want to be one of the emergency response donors, or do they want to maybe wait and see what the needs are as they unfold? What's the nature of their giving? Who do they want to support as priorities? And helping them create, if you like, their own philanthropic plan or framework for making decisions when they're asked. And I think that's a very helpful service. We always say, that we're a resource to donors. And I think that this is one very important way in these kinds of times where we can be helpful. And it can be just through a conversation. We haven't developed a fancy tool that donors work out themselves. We just help them think it through. So for example, one donor I was speaking with was sort of started the call with saying, I have $100,000 available in my fund. I want to grant it to your pandemic response fund. And as we talked, he talked a lot about, I really want to get to the grassroots. I want food on people's tables right away. And at the end, I said, when I listen to you, I think of the food security and food share in our community, and how that might really better align. Rather than giving it to a bigger open fund, would this be something you would rather do? And he reflected on that and said, yes, that actually is. And so helping people think through their options so that they are most satisfied with their giving. And then there's some of the enabling donors to act quickly in that, ensuring that there are flow-through options, that we've streamlined some of our back office processes so that maybe what used to take 2 weeks can be done now in 3 days, and how to really facilitate donors getting their donations to where they want them to go. One of the things that are, maybe I could go to the next slide, please, Cindy. One of the things that we learned, again, a lot from in 2008, and we've continued to look at policies and practices in the current environment, was how important it is to have those policies firmly in place, certain policies, and also a transparency about those. So after 2008, when, in the following year, when almost all of our funds were underwater and couldn't grant, and it was going to take a long time for some of them to actually crawl back out, we took it upon ourselves, and it took most of all living fund holders, and talk about changing their fund agreements to enable them to encroach with a limit on that, or if they didn't want to encroach on capital in a year when there was no income, to allow us to, when there was more available, to establish an individual fund reserve. And we identified that as 8%, so 2 years worth of granting. So as we move forward now, we are in a position now, even though we just had our year end and things will be under, that all of the funds will have ability to grant. And as the earlier slide said, this is when people most need those grants and donors really want to grant. Another thing we're doing, our year end was at March 31st. So typically people would not get their fund status statements until the audit was complete and, it had gone through all the processes, and that would be probably the end of June. This year, we've done some preliminary, our finance team has done the preliminary work and is going to be informing people this week of what they will have available, what we anticipate they will have available, and enabling them to access 95% of that. So this is a new policy that was approved by the board, but it will enable people, in fact, if they wish, to get their available dollars out the door right away without having to wait, into the summer. So again, it's being thinking about all the resources that we have at our fingertips, and also really listening to what donors are saying they want to do, and figuring out what we can do to enable them to achieve that. And what are the, thinking through obviously the implications of those things, making sure that it is a solid foundation of policy and practice, but trying to be more flexible and open things up. Also working with donors and helping donors for donor advised funds think about how they will respond to grantees who can't do what their grants were from last year were expected to do. And again, following the lead of our grants team who have been having those discussions, it would be the grants team that would have these discussions, not donors, obviously, about, is this a grant that just needs more time post-pandemic? Is this a grant that needs to be redirected and requesting permission to do that? Because the service isn't being offered that was funded, but certainly there are other needs being met by that organization. Or is this a grant that needs to be returned because it will never be able to be implemented as hoped? So just to go to the last point there, the recognition of donors and privacy. It's really just underlying the notion, this is from the last recognition of donors and privacy, that just a caution again in this flurry of activity, just to pay that extra attention to those donors who say, I don't want to be acknowledged. And again, we have many charts and Excel spreadsheets and wonderful FIMs and all of those things, but we're very conscious that this is an opportunity to make a mistake around privacy and to make sure that we try to avoid that. And so asking again clearly with donors, how they want to be recognized. So the last slide is just a reminder, if you could go ahead, thanks. And I think it's just a very important thing that community foundations, I think, are in a very unique position in our communities. And we're respected because we're kind of the steady ship, I think, often. We're thoughtful leaders more and more. We're assuming leadership in many communities on very complex issues. But we have a lot of trust and integrity. And so I think we are a very important pillar during these turbulent times. And to again think about in our relationships, in our communications, how important that kind of thoughtful, calming, but taking action position is to people in a world that just seems to be some days falling apart and very, very uncertain. So that's my thought.
Okay, thank you so much, Mary Beth and Sherry. There's a couple of observations here I just wanted to share, because I know we have some community foundations that are on a smaller scale. But the one thing is this can all be scaled. And I'll just share with you briefly a story of a small community foundation with a part-time staff member, under $2 million in assets, who really focused on outreach to their fund holders in the first couple of weeks of the pandemic, and particularly targeting those over 60, and divvied up the list with the board. So it was a great way to engage the board. And with those questions that you just talked about,
How are you doing? Is there anything you need? And this is what's happening at the foundation. We're here to support you, you know, give us a call, and really making themselves open and available. So even for a small foundation, those first steps in outreach in terms of stewarding donors is so doable. And again, a great way to engage the board. And, you know, and to your thought, Sherry, about, you know, this isn't the time community foundations start to claw back. And I think so many of us learned that lesson in 2008 and 2009, where we did stop granting for many community foundations, and to the detriment of not only our community, but also to the frustration of our donors. And those were really painful lessons that I think a lot of community foundations learned in 08 and 09. And so we need to, you know, I think we've been much more mindful of that. And especially during this time where it's just not about the investments. It's about our health and well-being. It's about, you know, this isolation. It's about supporting these organizations that are working around the clock. And so a slightly different strategy, but just as important. So folks, if you have any questions of Mary Beth and Sherry while they're on the line here, please feel free to drop that into your chat box, and you know, we'll take a few minutes to field any questions that you may have. Sherry and Mary Beth, any other comments that you might have popped up while each other were speaking?
I was curious, actually, Cindy, to hear what other people are doing that we didn't cover.
Yes, absolutely. We'd love to hear stories about how people are engaging their donors right now. And oh, I just need to unmute Mary Beth. Yes, happy to do that. So if you have some other stories, we'd be happy to hear them and share them, because this is what it's all about. There you go, Mary Beth.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to say one other thing that we've done that I think is something that other organizations can do, no matter size, is when we were on the phone with donors, we knew we were going to hear requests for information or almost requests for help. And we didn't want to put our staff in a position where they were, you know, offering to pick up prescriptions or putting themselves in any danger. So what we did do was we worked with our grants team on what is happening, what are the resources that are available in our community. And so it's a resource guide that we had while we were on the phones or on communicating with donors over email, that said, what are the services that are happening? What, how does one order groceries online? How do you order groceries if you don't have access to internet? All of those kinds of details in a step-by-step guide, so that our staff were able to provide donors with that information when asked.
Mm-hmm. Great. Here's a question, and it's a good one. Do you think it's worth engaging donors by email when they're probably getting bombarded, like you've indicated, by the COVID updates and other emails? Is a phone call the optimum, and or should email be totally avoided?
It's Mary Beth, and Sherry, I can pause. Or I can start and then you can.
Why don't you start? Go ahead.
Okay. What we did was we really did meet our donors where they were. So if a donor has primarily communicated with us by email, we followed that. But for a lot of our donors, we did pick up the phone, and you'll see my colleague who works in the area of legacy, her phone calls are, you know, anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour right now, because for some of our donors, she's the only call that they're receiving right now. And so that is the best donor engagement we can do, is just be there. And she is actually repeating some of those calls and doing them on a more regular basis. So I would say I'm really encouraging our team to also write notes right now, because that's something that people aren't used to receiving a lot of, and it's kind of nice too. But I would say too, to kind of echo what Sherry had said in her last point around recognition and making sure that you're sort of maintaining what the donor's desires are and the donor's wishes are. We had a grantee who had approached one of our donor advisors and led for an urgent campaign, and actually led with the statement, "We know you don't want to hear from us, that you have a do not contact. However, this is so important, so we're not following those rules," which was a little alarming to us. So we're really making sure that we're always doing what the donor preference is. And if we're able to do an extra step that's a little more special and we know the donor will be okay with that, we're certainly doing that when we can. Sherry.
No, I would agree totally with everything you said.
I love Hamilton.
Yeah. So here's another question. We were about to launch our Legacy Giving Circle with 2 families supporting this initiative. Would you recommend us moving forward with this, do a soft launch, or something different? And they've engaged with the families and they're okay with moving forward right now, but would like some feedback on that.
It's Mary Beth. Sherry, do you want to start?
I can, sure.
Sure.
I mean, my thought would be to really look at the approach you're going to take and make sure that you can carry it out kind of without a break, if you know what I mean. Like, I wouldn't want to start launching it now, and then because of the nature of what you plan to do, that you can't get back to it for 4 months and that there's a gap. I think, I think again, it is on a lot of people's minds. So it's sort of how one approaches that, but I don't think it's out of the question to start now. What do you think, Mary Beth?
Yeah, I would agree. It's something that I've really put a lot of thought into because, as you said, Sherry, it is on a lot of people's minds. We've heard the statistic that it's one of the most downloaded. Will kits are now one of the most downloaded things right now, and we also have heard from our colleagues in the legal community that they're very busy with these plans. So it's balancing that donor service by providing that information that we know people are wanting, with not appearing to be taking advantage of a really scary time. So I would just be very cautious of your messaging. Just make sure that it's more of a, providing this information and this service, because it might be interpreted in different ways by different people. So I would also really test it on other donors to make sure that you have thought of it in all perspectives.
Yeah, that's great advice. There's a number of community foundations that I know are celebrating milestone years, 25th anniversaries and so on, and had plans to do some legacy type campaigns or, an undesignated campaign, and have put that aside, of course, and struggling with that right now. So that's great advice. And I think too, knowing that it's still business as usual as well. And that balance of, we've got this pandemic and this crisis that we're dealing with, but there's also this other work that we continue to do on a day-to-day basis. And that's a bit of a juggling game.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And it's certainly, we're in a time of prioritizing and making sure that what we thought we were going to do at this time is very different than what we were doing. But there are the day-to-day things that we still continue to do that is still equally important. People still need to receive their tax receipts. They still need to be thanked. There's still processing, mail still arriving. We're handling mail in a different way. Safety, and we're making sure that people are washing their hands and sanitizing their hands after mail's delivered, and those kinds of things that we never thought were going to be a reality even 6 weeks ago. But how we're doing things and how we're responding, there's little things that we've added to our email signatures have changed, that we're acknowledging COVID and that we're working remotely, how we're working. We're being very honest that there are children in the background. My dog tried to enter the room while I was presenting. These are things that normally wouldn't happen, but are now becoming commonplace. And the other piece that we are doing is, you'll notice, and we're closing everything, including our message to donors, that we hope that you and those you love remain safe, which is not as a closing that we're used to doing. So we've had to adapt, and I think organizations that are adaptable will be okay through this, because we're kind of leading our donors and they're leading us through this very strange time.
Sherry, any comments to add to that?
No, I think that's a very nice way of putting it.
Yeah, I agree. I think, for community foundations and moving forward in this way, being open and accessible to our donors and having those important conversations really bodes well in the long run. But yet I know there's a bit of a paralysis happens sometimes with community foundations and the board, because they look at the bottom line of the dollars and how the investments are doing, and struggle with how to move forward. And so I think some of the things that you've laid out today are really helpful in engaging board members and but also as a team and connecting with donors. So thank you for that. We'll just got a couple more minutes, folks, if anybody has a question before we wrap up. Otherwise, I'll just remind people, if you go to our events page, we'll be listing any other upcoming webinars. We're just working on a couple more in the next few weeks. Also, our page that's dedicated to how community foundations are responding to COVID-19. There's a great map that shares what community foundations are doing across the country, links to some wonderful resources, and so many things. And it's also part of a weekly newsletter that goes out. So if you haven't signed up for it, go to the page, and at the bottom is a link to sign up for this newsletter if you're not getting it right now. Another question here around, do you think it's appropriate to share details about how your revenue is being impacted with donors when these things are still up in the air and still evolving? And Sherry, I'm going to turn that to you, because I know you were there in 08 and 09 and about how we communicated with donors about this.
Again, I think our principle, the underlying principle, is about being open and transparent, and having the confidence in us, right? So, I mean, it's no secret about what the stock market's doing, and the trouble that the not-for-profit sector is in, and whatever. And so, I think our message, and a lot of this comes from the CEO, is about that we anticipate, there are losses, but this is what we're doing. We're cutting our expenses. We're really looking at how we, best use this. We're revisiting all of our impact investments and making sure that they have what they need to be successful. And that we anticipate that people are being affected by this financially, and it may affect their giving at the moment, but that as a community, we have to respect these things and we will get through it. And as an organization, we're not trying to pretend that these things aren't happening, but it's a work in process too, that we're looking at all different strategies to address them. So it's maybe not scaring them with specific numbers, but rather with our approach, and that we understand this. We're doing a number of things to address it, and we kind of are in this together, but with our mission being at the forefront.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay. Any other final comments, folks? If not, we will wrap up. Thank you. so much for joining us today, and my apologies for the rocky start there. And Kathy, I'm sorry we couldn't connect with you, but we know you were here in spirit, and thank you so much. And Mary Beth and Sherry, thank you for pulling this together and being with us today. I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and expertise around this. So thank you again.
Thank
Pleasure.
you for having us. Thank you.
Keep well, everyone.
Yeah,
Yes.
stay safe, everyone.
Yes.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.